The neighbors laughed at the widow who went underground with her son. She covered the house with fur to survive the winter. When the coldest weather arrived, it became clear who was right. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The land at the edge of the northern frontier had a way of exposing weakness. It did not announce itself as hostile. It did not roar or threaten. It simply waited. Wide, pale valleys stretched between low, wind-scarred hills, and beyond them rose the mountains, distant and blue, like something ancient that had learned patience. The sky above was vast and indifferent, changing moods without warning. A morning could begin clear and gentle, and by afternoon the wind would arrive, cutting across the plain with a cold that seemed to come not from the air, but from the bones of the earth itself. Eleanor Crane had learned this landscape slowly, not as a place to be admired, but as a force to be endured. Her claim sat where most others refused to settle, too far from reliable water, too exposed to the mountain weather, too lonely to offer comfort. On the surveyor's map, it was nothing more than a marked square, a name written in ink. On the ground, it was a test that never ended. The nearest neighbor lived miles away, far enough that smoke from a chimney was a rare and reassuring sight. Roads were little more than stubborn tracks pressed into dirt by wagon wheels that might not return for weeks. Help, when it came at all, came late. Eleanor had once believed that sharing the burden made the land manageable. That belief had died with her husband. The winter he was lost did not arrive dramatically. It crept in quietly, night by night, tightening its grip before anyone realized it had settled for good. He had gone out to check traps before the first heavy snow, promising to return before dusk. Eleanor remembered standing in the doorway of their cabin, watching his figure grow smaller against the pale hills, thinking only about supper and whether the firewood would last the night. When he did not return, she told herself he was delayed, that the weather had turned him back, that he would come in the morning with an apology and a tired smile. Morning came without him. The search lasted longer than most did on the frontier, not because there was much hope, but because no one wanted to be the one to stop looking. Men rode out in pairs, calling his name into the wind, scanning ravines and tree lines. Eleanor waited, day after day, keeping the fire lit, keeping the door unbarred, listening for footsteps that never came. She felt the truth settle into her long before the search ended. It was not a thought so much as a certainty, the kind that sinks into the body and refuses to leave. When the snow finally melted enough to reveal his body at the bottom of a ravine weeks later, the grief had already hollowed her out. What remained was quiet resolve. The funeral was brief. On the frontier, death was familiar, and ceremony was a luxury. Words were spoken, hats were removed, hands were shaken. Then the men mounted their horses and rode away, back to their own claims, their own fires. Eleanor returned to the cabin alone. She might have left then. Many widows did. Town offered walls that did not move in the wind, and neighbors close enough to hear a cry. Work could be found, food bought instead of hunted, warmth borrowed instead of fought for. It was what sensible people did. Eleanor knew this. She also knew that sensible choices had not kept her husband alive. She stayed because of her son. Nathan was 10 years old and too quiet for his age, a child who listened more than he spoke and watched the world as if it might break without warning. The winter his father died had marked him in ways Eleanor did not yet fully understand. He had grown thinner, his cough lingering long after the snow melted. At night, he sometimes shivered, even when wrapped in blankets, his small body struggling to hold warmth that seemed determined to escape him. Eleanor would wake and press her hand to his forehead, counting his breaths in the dark, afraid of what morning might bring. The cabin they lived in was not meant for such winters. It had been built quickly in their first year, raised from rough timber with more hope than skill. Gaps had opened between the logs as the wood dried and twisted. Wind found those gaps easily. In the coldest months, frost crept along the inside walls, delicate and cruel, turning breath into clouds and water into ice before it could reach the floor. Eleanor learned to move quietly at night, so her steps would not break the thin skin of ice that formed near the door. She burned chairs, then shelves, then anything that would catch flame. Still, the cold came. One night, after the fire had died to embers, she woke to silence that felt wrong. Nathan lay too still beside her, his face pale, his hands cold, even through the blanket. Panic sharpened her movements as she fed the fire, wrapped him in her own coat, rubbed warmth back into his fingers. He lived, but the fear did not leave her. It settled in her chest and stayed there. She understood then that the cabin was no longer shelter. It was an enemy that pretended to be a home. As autumn returned, bringing with it the first sharp mornings, Eleanor found herself remembering things she had not thought about in years. Her mother's voice, low and steady, telling stories by firelight. Tales of hunters who lived through winters by listening to the land instead of fighting it. Of shelters built not above the earth, but within it, lined with hides and shaped like dens rather than houses. Places where the wind could not reach and the cold lost its teeth. These were not stories meant to impress. They were lessons disguised as memory. Eleanor had dismissed them once, when her husband laughed and said they were not animals, that people belonged above ground. She had laughed with him then. Now, as she watched Nathan sleep restlessly beneath layers of blankets that did nothing to keep the chill away, the laughter felt like something borrowed from another life. The idea came to her slowly, unwelcome and persistent. It returned each time the wind rattled the cabin walls, each time Nathan coughed in his sleep. She tried to push it aside, to think of safer, more acceptable solutions, reinforcing the walls, adding another stove, leaving. None of it felt sufficient. None of it felt certain. One morning, with frost still clinging to the grass, Eleanor took her coat and walked the land behind the cabin. The hills rose gently there, their slopes shaped by years of weather and neglect. She studied them the way she once studied her husband's maps, looking for signs others might miss. She pressed her boot into the soil, feeling its resistance. She watched how water moved after rain, where it gathered and where it fled. She stood still long enough to feel the direction of the wind against her face. When she returned to the cabin, her hands were numb and her decision was made. She did not announce it. She did not explain it to Nathan. Not yet. She took the shovel from its place by the door and walked back to the hill. The first thrust of metal into earth sent a shock through her arms. The soil resisted, stubborn and cold. Eleanor leaned into it, breathing hard, and drove the shovel down again. Each movement was deliberate, not desperate. She worked until her shoulders burned and her breath came in short bursts, carving a shallow wound into the hillside. By the time the sun dipped low, she had little to show for her effort. A narrow cut in the earth, nothing more. But as she stood there, dirt clinging to her boots, Eleanor felt something she had not felt since before her husband's death. Not hope exactly, but resolve. The kind that does not ask permission. She looked back once toward the cabin, its crooked outline dark against the sky. Then she turned again to the hill and raised the shovel. Winter was coming. This time, she would not wait for it to decide her fate. The cut Eleanor had made in the hillside looked insignificant in the pale morning light, a shallow wound that could be erased by a single hard rain. She stood before it, with her breath fogging the air, feeling the stiffness in her shoulders from the day before. The ache was deep and honest, the kind that did not frighten her. Pain meant effort, and effort meant motion, and motion was the only thing that kept fear from settling in. She returned to the hill each day after that, working in the hours when Nathan was occupied with his chores or reading by the window. At first, she dug without a clear shape in mind, removing soil carefully, learning how the earth behaved under her hands. The top layer fought her at every turn. Roots twisted around the shovel blade, stones hid just beneath the surface and had to be pried loose inch by inch. Progress was slow and often discouraging. More than once she stopped, leaning on the shovel, wondering if the neighbors were right, if the hill would defeat her before winter arrived. Then the soil changed. A foot below the surface, the ground grew denser and darker. The loose dirt gave way to clay that held together when cut, leaving clean edges that did not crumble back into place. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Clay meant stability. Clay meant walls that could stand if treated with respect. She slowed her movements, began shaping rather than hacking, carving a shallow horizontal passage that angled slightly upward toward the interior, so water would never be tempted to linger. The air inside the growing space felt different, quieter, as if the hill were already learning to close itself around her work. She did not tell Nathan at first. When he discovered what she was doing, standing at the entrance with his hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes wide with questions he did not yet know how to ask, she waited until evening to explain. They sat by the fire in the failing cabin, the wind sighing through the cracks as if listening. She told him the hill would keep them warm. She told him the earth knew how to hold heat better than wood ever could. She did not tell him she was afraid. She did not need to. Nathan listened in silence, his gaze steady. When she finished, he nodded once, as if accepting a lesson rather than a promise. From that night on, he followed her to the hill whenever he could, handing her tools, clearing debris, learning the weight of work without complaint. As the space grew deeper, Eleanor began to think in terms of form. She did not want a square chamber, with corners that trapped cold and moisture. She shaped the room into a gentle oval, walls curving inward, ceiling rising toward a central point. The earth seemed to approve of this, settling comfortably against the shape, distributing its weight evenly. She imagined the chamber as something alive, a hollow carved within a larger body, meant to cradle rather than contain. When the hole was deep enough that the light from outside no longer reached the back wall, Eleanor knew it was time to begin the work that mattered most. The hides came slowly. Eleanor had never been a careless hunter, and she did not begin now. Each animal taken was used completely, meat dried and stored, bones set aside for tools or broth, sinew saved. She traded butter and preserved vegetables for skins she could not procure herself, making careful choices. Not all hides were equal. Some held warmth, but trapped moisture. Others shed water, but offered little insulation. She selected deer for their balance, elk for strength, bison for thickness where it mattered most. Each skin was scraped and stretched, worked until her hands burned and her arms trembled. The smell of fat and earth clung to her clothes. Nathan learned to tolerate it without complaint, learning as much from observation as from instruction. The process took time. Hides were soaked, cleaned, dried, then worked again. Eleanor rendered animal fat and mixed it with wood ash and resin, creating a paste that she rubbed into the skins until they drank it in. This, her mother had said, was what kept rot at bay, what turned a simple pelt into a barrier against damp and decay. Eleanor tested each hide with water before bringing it into the chamber, watching how the liquid beaded and ran, how the skin resisted saturation. The wooden frame came next. Eleanor cut and set posts along the walls, spacing them evenly, fitting horizontal beams into notches she carved herself. She worked with care born of necessity, knowing that one weak point could undo everything. The structure was simple but sound, a skeleton that would bear the weight of earth and time. When it stood complete, the chamber looked less like a hole and more like the beginning of a dwelling. She began layering the hides the way she had been taught, though no one stood beside her to correct her hand. The first layer went between the packed earth and the wooden frame, thick skins placed with the rough side outward, forming a barrier that broke the passage of cold and damp before it could reach the interior. Over this, she packed clay mixed with straw, pressing it into every gap until the walls became a single, continuous surface. The second layer was the heart of the design. She hung softer hides with the fur turned inward, creating pockets of trapped air that held warmth the way an animal's own coat did. The chamber changed as she worked. Sounds softened. The air felt less sharp. Even without a fire, the space began to hold the day's warmth long after the sun had dipped behind the hills. The final layer was thinner, smoother skins, stretched and treated until they were supple and nearly pale. These she placed on the interior surface, rubbing them down until they lay flat, reflecting heat back into the room and shedding any moisture that might collect. She sealed the seams with a mixture of resin and clay, leaving no place for cold to creep in unnoticed. The sealing required the most patience. Condensation, her mother had warned, was the enemy of underground homes. Eleanor lined the roof with hides angled slightly, so moisture would run toward channels she carved into the walls, where it could be guided away and out through the entrance slope. It was slow, careful work, but when she finished, the ceiling felt dry to the touch even on damp mornings. Nathan became part of the process, without either of them naming it as such. He learned the feel of a good hide beneath his fingers, the way a properly treated skin resisted tearing, the way fur trapped warmth. He made mistakes and learned from them. One afternoon, he brought her a hide she would have rejected weeks earlier. She showed him why, running water over it until it darkened and sagged. He nodded, embarrassed but attentive, and did not repeat the error. The neighbors noticed, of course. They always did. At first, they laughed openly, calling it a burrow, a grave lined with fur. Eleanor heard their voices drifting across the land when the wind carried sound just right. She did not answer them. She had learned the futility of arguing with people who believed warmth was something you fought rather than preserved. At night, when doubt crept in with the dark, she sat alone in the chamber, listening. The earth pressed close on every side, not threatening, but present. The smells of hide and clay mingled with the faint scent of resin. She lit a small fire in the hearth she had begun to shape, watching how the heat moved, how the smoke followed the channel she had cut toward the angled vent. When she extinguished the flame, the warmth lingered. By the time the first hard frost silvered the valley, the chamber was ready to be tested. Eleanor and Nathan sat together inside as the temperature dropped outside, listening to the wind scour the hillside. Inside, the air remained steady. Nathan leaned against the wall, his eyes closing without effort. Eleanor watched him breathe, slow and even, and felt something loosen in her chest. Above them, the frontier prepared for winter the way it always did, with resignation and stubborn hope. Below the surface, Eleanor Crane had built something different. Not a house in the way her neighbors understood it, but a skin wrapped around life itself, shaped by memory and necessity. As the cold settled in earnest, she knew the real test was still to come. But for the first time since her husband's death, she believed she had met it on her own terms. Winter did not announce itself with ceremony. It arrived the way it always did on the frontier, quietly at first, with mornings that bit harder than the day before, and nights that refused to loosen their grip. Frost lingered on the ground long after sunrise, and the soil rang beneath a boot heel like thin glass. Eleanor felt the change, not as surprise, but as confirmation. The land was closing its fist. The first snow fell before the end of autumn, light and deceptive, melting by midday and leaving behind a false sense of mercy. Then came the second, heavier and more deliberate, followed by a third that did not melt at all. The valley transformed inch by inch, color draining from the world until everything lay beneath the same pale skin. Eleanor watched it from the doorway of the old cabin one last time, noting how the wind slipped through the cracks as easily as ever, how the walls offered no resistance to the cold. She closed the door and did not return. Moving into the underground house felt less like relocation than retreat. They carried down only what mattered: food, tools, blankets, the few books Nathan cherished, and the small objects that still tethered Eleanor to the life she had lost. The cabin above was left standing, but empty, its fire cold, its purpose finished. Below the hill, the new dwelling waited, quiet and steady. The first nights passed without incident. Eleanor kept the fire small, testing the balance between warmth and air. She learned how long the chamber held heat once the flames died, how the walls gave it back slowly, evenly, without demand. Nathan slept deeply, his color returning, the tension easing from his small frame. Eleanor lay awake beside him, listening not for the wind, but for the sound of settling earth, for any sign of failure. None came. Outside, the frontier began to struggle. Livestock suffered first. Cattle froze, standing in their fields when the temperature dropped too fast for men to react. Horses refused to leave shelter, their breath hanging in thick clouds. Wells iced over, chimneys clogged with snow and soot. Eleanor heard the stories when neighbors passed by the hill, their voices carrying farther in the cold air. There was anger in those voices, and fear and disbelief that winter had come so hard, so early. Then the storms began. The wind arrived one night without warning, a sudden force that struck the hillside like a living thing. It screamed across the valley, tearing at anything that dared to rise above the ground. Eleanor felt it not as sound, but as pressure, a distant weight that pressed down and slid past, unable to find purchase. Inside the chamber, the air barely stirred. Nathan woke once, confused by the muffled roar, and Eleanor pulled him close, murmuring until his breathing slowed. Snow followed, driven sideways, piling against the hill until the entrance tunnel vanished beneath it. Eleanor cleared it when she could, careful not to open the door for long. Each time she did, the cold surged inward like a predator scenting weakness. She learned to move quickly, to seal the barrier again before the warmth could escape. On the third day of the storm, she heard a sound that did not belong to the wind. At first, she thought it was imagination, the mind's habit of creating patterns out of chaos. Then it came again, faint but unmistakable, a dull thud against the hidden door, followed by something like a cry. Eleanor reached for her coat and pulled it on with steady hands. She told Nathan to stay back and approach the entrance. When she opened the door, the cold struck like a blow. Snow swirled into the tunnel, filling the narrow space with white fury. Beyond it, shapes moved, hunched and struggling. Eleanor saw hands, red and bare, and faces so pale they looked carved from ice. She did not hesitate. She pulled them inside one by one, slamming the door shut against the storm. There were 4 of them. A man and a woman Eleanor recognized from the far end of the valley, their names lost to the immediacy of the moment, and 2 children clinging to them, silent with shock. They collapsed onto the packed floor, shaking violently, eyes unfocused. The woman tried to speak and failed. The younger child did not move at all. Eleanor moved as if guided by something older than thought. Blankets came first, then warm water from the kettle she kept ready, then broth ladled carefully into mouths that could barely swallow. She stripped frozen clothing and replaced it with dry hides and wool. The fire was fed until the chamber glowed with heat. Slowly, painfully, life returned. Fingers twitched. A sob broke free. The child stirred, crying weakly, and Eleanor felt the tightness in her chest ease. They had seen the faint line of smoke rising from the hill, the man explained hours later, his voice hoarse. Their house had not survived the night. The roof had gone first, torn away by the wind. Then the walls had begun to fail. They had run with nothing but instinct and luck, following the only sign of warmth left in the valley. They were not the last. Before the storm relented, others came. A young man separated from his family while trying to drive cattle to shelter. An old trapper who had taken refuge beneath a fallen tree until the cold forced him onward. A woman carrying an infant wrapped in rags, her face gray with exhaustion. Each arrival cost warmth. Each opening of the door let the cold test the house's defenses. Eleanor watched the fire, adjusted the vents, rationed space and supplies. The chamber grew crowded, bodies pressed close, the air thick with breath and fear. They slept in turns. They ate sparingly. They spoke in low voices, sharing stories not to pass time, but to stay anchored to the idea of survival. Nathan moved among them quietly, offering cups, holding hands, lending his small strength without being asked. Eleanor watched him and understood that something in him was changing, shaped by necessity the way the house itself had been shaped. Outside, the world endured what it could not withstand. The storm howled without pause, a constant assault that erased distance and direction. Time blurred. Eleanor measured it by the fire, by the needs of those sheltering with her, by the sound of breathing in the dark. She thought of her husband then, not with sharp grief, but with a distant ache. She wondered if he had known fear in his final moments, if he had felt alone. She hoped, fiercely, that he had not. When the wind finally died, it did so abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it rang. Eleanor opened the door and stepped into a world unrecognizable. Snow lay piled high against the hill, sculpted into strange shapes by days of relentless force. The sky above was painfully blue, the sun bright and cold. One by one, the others emerged, blinking, shielding their eyes, staring at the devastation. They spoke little as they went their separate ways, returning to what remained of their lives. Gratitude was expressed in quiet gestures rather than words. Eleanor did not expect thanks. She had built the house for one reason alone, and that reason slept beside the fire, warm and alive. In the weeks that followed, the valley counted its losses. Houses collapsed. Families mourned. Children did not return from journeys they should have survived. The storm became something people named, a thing set apart from ordinary winter. And woven through the stories of death and ruin was another story, spoken first in disbelief and then in reverence, of a woman who had gone underground, of a house that did not freeze, of lives pulled back from the edge by hides, earth, and stubborn refusal to accept what everyone else believed inevitable. Eleanor listened and said little. She returned to the chamber each night, tending the fire, reinforcing what needed reinforcing, teaching Nathan what he would one day need to know. Winter was not finished, but it had shown its hand, and for the first time, the surface world had learned that there was another way to endure it. Spring did not arrive as a celebration. It came cautiously, as if uncertain it would be welcomed after what the land had done. The snow withdrew in stages, loosening its hold one slow day at a time, retreating into shaded hollows and north-facing slopes where it lingered stubbornly, refusing to admit defeat. Water ran everywhere, carving temporary paths across the valley floor, filling ruts and gullies, carrying away what had not survived the cold. The air softened, but it carried a heaviness with it, the kind that follows disaster when relief and grief exist side by side without knowing how to separate. Eleanor stepped out of the hillside house each morning to assess what the winter had left behind. The cabin above still stood, but it looked like a relic now, abandoned and fragile, its roof bowed, its walls gray and warped. She did not enter it. There was nothing there she needed. The underground house, by contrast, emerged from the thaw almost unchanged. The hides held. The walls remained dry. The air inside stayed steady and calm, as if winter had passed over it without noticing. The valley told a harsher story. Neighbors moved through the landscape like survivors of a shipwreck, salvaging what they could from the wreckage of their lives. Roofs lay collapsed beneath snow that had frozen and thawed and frozen again. Fences were flattened. Livestock losses were counted in quiet voices. Some houses stood empty, their doors hanging open, their silence heavier than any damage. Eleanor did not need a tally to know how many had been lost. The absence was visible everywhere. People came to her then, not in the desperation of the storm, but in the uneasy calm that followed. They approached the hill slowly, as if unsure they were welcome, as if half expecting the house to vanish when they drew too close. Eleanor met them without ceremony. She listened to their stories. She nodded when words failed them. She offered warmth and water, and when asked, explanation. They wanted to know how the house had survived, why the cold had not claimed it the way it had claimed everything else. Eleanor answered simply, without embellishment. She spoke of soil and shape, of airflow and moisture, of hides treated and placed with intention. She spoke of listening to the land instead of trying to conquer it. Some understood immediately. Others struggled, their minds still anchored to the idea that survival required height and visibility, walls raised against the sky rather than embraced by the earth. She did not argue. She showed them. When the ground dried enough to work, she began teaching in earnest. At first it was informal. A few people gathered near the hill, watching as she pointed out details they might have missed. How the entrance angled upward to shed water. How the interior curve prevented cold pockets from forming. How the layers worked together rather than against one another. She demonstrated the feel of a properly treated hide, the difference between one that would hold warmth and one that would betray it. She explained why the ceiling mattered as much as the walls, why moisture was as dangerous as cold. Nathan stood beside her, quiet and attentive, handing her tools, answering questions when he could. He had grown over the winter, not in height, but in presence. People listened to him without surprise, as if the winter had rewritten their understanding of who could hold knowledge and who could carry it forward. Word spread. More came. Some brought offerings, not as payment, but as gesture. Firewood, food, labor. Eleanor accepted what was useful and refused what was not. She did not charge for the knowledge. It seemed wrong to place a price on something that had been bought with fear and necessity. What she taught was not hers alone. It belonged to the land and to the traditions that had outlasted more winters than any of them could remember. By autumn, there were new cuts in the hillsides beyond her own, careful and deliberate. The valley began to change shape, not upward, but inward. Houses appeared that did not announce themselves from a distance, their entrances modest, their presence felt rather than seen. Some improved upon Eleanor's methods. A man who had once worked as an engineer refined the ventilation, creating a system that managed moisture more efficiently. Others adapted the design to different soils, different slopes. Eleanor welcomed these changes. She visited when she could, offered advice when asked, learned from what others discovered. The winter that followed was harsh, but it was not catastrophic. The shelters held. Losses were fewer. Fear, though not gone, was tempered by preparation. Eleanor watched this with a quiet satisfaction she did not name. She had not intended to change the valley. She had intended only to keep her son alive. Everything else had followed from that single purpose. Years passed in this way, marked by seasons rather than events. Nathan grew into a young man who understood the land as a living system rather than an obstacle. He took what Eleanor taught him and expanded upon it, combining her methods with his own observations. When he left for a time to see more of the world, he returned with new ideas, new respect for what they had built together. The hillside house remained the center of their lives, its walls bearing the marks of use and care, its warmth unchanged. Eleanor aged quietly. Her hands stiffened, her steps slowed. But the work did not leave her. She taught as long as people came to learn. She listened more than she spoke, content to let others take the knowledge and make it their own. The house outlived trends and arguments, outlived the memory of those who had once mocked it. It stood as proof without needing to defend itself. When Eleanor died, it was in winter, as if the season itself had come to claim what it could not defeat. She passed in her sleep, wrapped in the warmth she had built, the earth holding her, as it always had. Nathan buried her on the hill above the house, where the ground thawed earliest in spring. He marked the place simply. She would not have wanted more. The house remained. Years later, people would come to walk its curved walls, to feel the steady air and the quiet that seemed to exist apart from the world above. They would ask guides to explain how it worked, how hides and soil and careful design had turned vulnerability into strength. They would listen, nod, and leave with fragments of understanding. What stayed with them was simpler. A woman lost everything and refused to surrender to the cold. She did not build higher or stronger in the way she was expected to. She went deeper. She trusted knowledge that had been dismissed and shaped it with her own hands. When winter came to break the surface world, she endured beneath it. And because she did, others endured too. The land remained unforgiving. It always would be. But beneath it, warmth waited for those willing to learn how to keep it. If this story stayed with you, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel for the next chapters and new stories like this one. Watch the other videos on the channel to continue the journey. And if this story mattered to you, share it with someone who would feel it too.